Hello, Linden. It's Larry Bash. I'm here representing the Linden Bureau of Parks and Recreation, and it's our Senior Citizen Lecture Series. Remember, we don't restrict it to senior citizens, but that's our primary participants, and we generally are putting together programs that they have asked for or raised questions about. Unfortunately, we're not able to meet face-to-face for a while because of the pandemic. Eventually, we'll get back together, I'm sure. Today is the fourth of 6 spring lectures. This group of lectures, 5 of the 6 came directly from participants asking for a subject to be discussed. Today's subject is U.S. presidential pardons, their use and misuse. We've had a long history of controversial pardons by the U.S. president. It's part of the Constitution. It's quite a strong presidential power. And in terms of the rest of the schedule, check the website, the city's website, and there's a schedule. And if you can't make any one of the scheduled lectures, the city is putting it on YouTube so you can watch it at your leisure at other times. The next topic will be on May 3rd, Monday, May 3rd, and it's going to be probably the biggest political upset, presidential upset of the 20th century, and that's the 1948 election of Harry Truman over the heavily favored Republican challenger, Thomas Dewey. It's, an interesting story, and people have expressed some interest in talking about it. Maybe there's some people in our senior citizen community that remember that election. The last of the 6 series will be Monday, May 10th, and it's going to be on how third parties have influenced U.S. presidential elections. We touched on this in connection with the course we had last year on the history of U.S. presidential elections, but we didn't get into it in the kind of depth that we're going to get into it on Monday, May 10th. Now, again, I would recommend that you register for these lectures. There is a way to do it through the Bureau of Parks and Recreation. You can do it on the city's website. I suggest it because we have supporting materials that in the past we handed out at the sessions we ran. We've gone to this idea of taping the lectures out of an abundance of caution. But we don't have a way to share those documents in this setting. So I like to think that probably the lectures stand on their own, but there are certain topics that a little supporting materials would enhance your understanding. It might lead to further looking at the issues on your own. For instance, I have in the packet of material that we're prepared to send out a summary of all of the presidential pardons by U.S. presidents. We will not go in depth onto all of them, but we will do a summary of them. What's good about it is it gives you information on the topic, and you can pursue it further if you like on issues that I will not be able to bring up because we don't have the time to go into in detail all the different pardons that are done. So please register and you can get those supporting materials. The presidential pardon power is broad and significant, and it's in the U.S. Constitution. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon because, remember, the Constitution is the product of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 that was a response to the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation. And the general issue was you needed more central power and control, and that was the main issue that drove the debates, the extent of federal powers versus states' rights. And it made for a pretty healthy debate. We have a record of it from the minutes that James Madison kept and the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were written primarily by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They're not legal documents. They're not part of the Constitution. They are the way they advocated for approving the Constitution, because each state had to approve the Constitution. By the way, it wasn't a sure thing. It was quite an involved process. And at the time of the first election, as we covered in one of our previous courses, 2 states were not able to vote because they hadn't yet approved the Constitution. That's North Carolina and Rhode Island. And of course, one state, New York, as we've talked about before, turned in the results in late and their votes didn't count. Remember, it's the electoral college system we're talking about, not a popular vote. And only 6 of those 13 states had a popular election to select electors for the choice of the president. So most states had a different method of selecting the electors. It's an indirect system. We didn't have a full-time popular vote for US president until 1824. And even ironically, in that situation, as we've discussed before, the winner of the most popular votes and the most electoral votes did not become president. And we've had a few situations over the years where one person won the popular vote and another person won the electoral college vote. It's an electoral college vote that controls. We saw that in 2000. Al Gore and George W. Bush, and we saw it in 2016 with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. So, kind of an interesting part of this issue of presidential pardons is that, as with a few things in the Constitution, it comes from the English experience. You remember, a lot of the Constitution reflects the former colonies' distrust of the system that involved the monarchy that was throughout Europe, particularly Great Britain. And they really went out of their way to take a different path. But in the case of the presidential pardons, that really is an outgrowth of the English common law and the Crown's right to pardon people that have somehow done something against the law, but the king reserved the right to be able to pardon them. And so that's why it's in the Constitution. That's why I should say that's where it comes from. I'm suspecting that this was requested as a topic because there were often presidents at the end of their term start issuing these pardons. Maybe because there's some controversy or political issues that they don't want to get into earlier in their term. I don't know, but quite often it's at the end of their term. Donald Trump, in leaving office, like many other presidents, had some fairly controversial pardons. And there was a lot of discussion about the pardon power, because if you recall, there was some discussion about whether, can the president pardon himself? Can you do a preemptive pardon for anything that may come up? there's been very little court tests of the president's pardon authority. The most recent one I can remember was during the Eisenhower administration, when Eisenhower took an action that commuted the death sentence of someone, but they kept in jail. And the courts basically said it was constitutional to do that. So the president could commute a sentence, he could change the sentence, he could do the pardon during the proceedings of some action, court action. And we have had cases where the pardon has been well after the effect. And we have a couple of odd examples of that. The one restriction is the president cannot pardon someone who's being impeached. That's the only exception. Now, you might think, and you'd be right, that this was a source of considerable debate during the Constitutional Convention, because many people were very uneasy about giving the president this kind of power. A lot of the discussion about the chief executive, because of this tension between the need for a central government and central powers and the preservation of states' rights and individual rights, it translated to a lot of debates on different issues. Remember, the Constitution wasn't ratified by most of the states until there was a commitment to have what we now call the Bill of Rights. And that was a whole series of individual protections. So they went ahead with the Constitution, they went ahead with the election of a new president, but in anticipation that the Bill of Rights would get passed. And it was very quick. I mean, the Bill of Rights, as we know it, are 10 Bill of Rights. There are 10 amendments to the Constitution, but there were proposals for more than 20, but only 10 survived. And it was done immediately after the adoption of the new government. So I'm sure you can figure out what the objection was to unlimited presidential pardon authority. Different delegates at the Constitutional Convention said, hey, this could mean that a president could direct someone to commit a crime or do something that's inappropriate with the expectation that they would then be pardoned. So they didn't like the idea of unlimited pardon power. You may recall when President Trump was being subjected to the scrutiny of the Mueller's report. Then later the Ukraine call, and later the Capitol insurrection. Particularly in connection with the Mueller report, Donald Trump many times sort of hinted at using his power of pardon to protect people if they didn't cooperate with the Mueller investigation. That's clearly an impeachable act. It's against the law. It's like witness tampering, obstruction of justice. But as often has been the case over the years with impeachment, many presidents have committed impeachable acts, but Congress has declined to proceed with impeachment, or if they did, not to the ultimate punishment, which is removal from office. You may recall in the most recent impeachment of President Trump in connection with the Capitol insurrection, there was some opposition to proceeding because they felt you couldn't constitutionally deal with a president who was leaving office in an impeachment process. The opposing argument was, well, The impeachment is for actions he took while he was president, and he was impeached while he was president. So it's constitutional to take action afterwards. Support for that position is connected with the record of the presidential pardons, because when James Madison, who was the main architect of the presidential pardon process, like the old ability of the crown in England to pardon any of his subjects, the main protection against the kind of misuse that was feared, according to James Madison, was impeachment. So pretty clearly, impeachment, and since a lot of pardons come at the end of a term, I mean, pretty clearly the Founding Fathers didn't have a problem with impeachment that occurred after someone left office. And actually there is some record of that, not with presidents, but with other federal officials, but it's never been challenged. And a very interesting issue, because particularly with the last impeachment attempt, that was sort of a burning issue for some members of the Senate who were, and I guess the House too, because there were a lot of votes against impeachment in the House too. So that's James Madison's response to, hey, the danger of the presidential pardon being misused. Hey, you got impeachment. You can take action if he's acting inappropriately. Remember, impeachment is not necessarily require someone to break the law. They can just act inappropriately. And the standard isn't a criminal standard like in a court. It's not a court. Impeachment is a political process. So the reasons for presidential pardons, now, by the way, you saw this in more recent times. Presidents often don't explain their pardons. It used to be there was a full explanation of them. Not so anymore. So sometimes we're kind of puzzled by why someone was pardoned. But an example would be, we have a lot of examples of family, friends, and public figures being pardoned for something. Some controversial, some not. We have clearly political motives behind pardons, which usually are controversial. And one of the issues here, of course, is theoretically, if someone is a part of a political scandal and they're pardoned, they also no longer have the protection of the Fifth Amendment. So they can be required to testify. I don't recall that ever being used or it ever being resulting in that. But so family, friends, public figures, there's political motives. There's what you might call reconciliation, where we've gone through something and the president would feel that there's a need to pardon the parties involved as a means of kind of resolving the problem that led to the conviction of the person for what it is. Remember, the pardon is only for federal crimes. I mean, someone could still be subject to civil action or actions based on state laws. We're actually seeing that being considered in the case of our recently departed president, President Trump. There are moves afoot to prosecute him for various things that are state laws or civil actions. And you may recall during the impeachment of Bill Clinton, the point was made that it didn't have to be a violation of the law for him to be impeached and convicted. And the other thing that we've seen is when there's a change in public attitude about a certain offense that led to a conviction, that the attitude about it has changed. And so presidents feel like they're correcting that action. The original concept that you see in the minutes of the debate at the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers is the ability to right a wrong, which could be any one of the things we just talked about. That doesn't explain why it's unlimited, but it does explain why they would adopt this, give this power to a president, much like the Crown in England used pardon power. Well, what I'd like to do now is to go through. I'm giving you some material if you register and we'll mail out to you. That has a little summary of all the presidents, how many pardons they issued, what for. It doesn't go into detail on every one of them, but it does document it. And it might be interesting. If you think this is an interesting topic, of course, some people asked for it. So that's why we're talking about it. So maybe you want to do further follow-up, and that would allow you to do it. You'd have that information. So let's review some of these pardons, how they came about, how they were used. Let's address what I call reconciliation issues. The first time that comes up is with our first president, George Washington. There was something called the Whiskey Rebellion during George Washington's first term. It was groups in Pennsylvania that were protesting against a liquor tax. They were protesting protests related to distilleries and people that consumed liquor, bought liquor. Washington, the whiskey tax was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, who was the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And George Washington decided to support it when he went around and talked to several government officials in different states. And generally the states supported it. It was a source of revenue, and that's why Alexander Hamilton wanted to do it. But it really got to the point, they tried to settle it peacefully. It got to the point where it really was sort of an armed rebellion. And the thing that triggered the problem was attacks on federal tax collection officials in Pennsylvania. Attacks at their homes, physical attacks on them. And George Washington's response is viewed as a very significant part of our history because he decided to take military action. He mobilized a militia and had them march into western Pennsylvania and deal with the people who were behind what is referred to as the Whiskey Rebellion. By the way, it's a little bit of an example of what's assumed under the Second Amendment. We've talked about this before. We had a couple of sessions on the amendments of the Constitution, and that was part of the Bill of Rights. Despite the positions of certain gun advocates, the reason for the Second Amendment was not protecting the right of someone to have weapons to go out and hunt or protect themselves for personal reasons, personal safety. It was designed to maintain the concept of a state militia, much like what we would now consider to be the National Guard, because the Founding Fathers were very suspicious of having a standing army. One of the Bill of Rights possibilities was not allow a standing army in terms of times of peace. And half of Washington's troops during the War for Independence were state militia. And that's what he used to deal with the folks involved with the Whiskey Rebellion. So several people were convicted of different offenses related to it. 2 people were convicted of treason and had the death penalty imposed. What George Washington did, and it was followed up by our second president, John Adams, he pardoned and in some cases commuted the sentences so they were less severe. And I really think that this was in the interest of reconciling. Now, by the way, there was considerable political backlash about the institution of this tax. And it was a major issue in the election of John Adams. I'm trying to think of the year now, which would be 1796 when he first ran as the second president and he won. And then later in 1800 when he lost his bid for re-election. And we ended up in a very involved process. We elected Thomas Jefferson. Remember, that was the flaw in the electoral college system that led to a tie, and it went to the House of Representatives, and it was delayed for months at a time between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. That was a big political weapon of what we then called the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, the imposition of that tax. And by the way, it was repealed under Thomas Jefferson. It never really was enforced because it was difficult to enforce. So there's an example of very early use of presidential pardon that's designed to reconcile. Franklin Pierce, who was a pre-Civil War president, used pardon powers to pardon a black man who aided escaped slaves. And again, it was a free black man. Those pre-Civil War days in the 1800s, starting with particularly like 1840, there was a lot of issues about slavery that eventually led to the Civil War. And one of them was the issue of what you do with escaped slaves. Because we had free states and we had slave states. So there's an example, again, reconciliation. Abraham Lincoln pardoned several members of Native Americans that were a part of the Great Sioux Uprising of 1862. Again, a reconciliation with the Native American community in connection with what essentially was an armed insurrection. Andrew Johnson, the president who became president with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, did a mass pardon of all Confederate soldiers, pardoning them for what could be considered treason. Again, part of a reconciliation process after the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, if you recall from your history books, was a Southern Democrat that Abraham Lincoln put on a ticket with him to replace his existing vice president when he first was elected in 1860. He was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who was supported the Union. And that was one of the ways Abraham Lincoln tried to help his re-election bid, which was touch and go for a while until, well, we had a lecture on it, which some of you may have listened to, either when it was we originally ran it on the TV channel and later on YouTube. He was not anti-slavery, but he was pro-union. And of course, he had a disastrous presidency because he always was clashing with the reform Republican Reconstructionist on issues dealing with civil rights and black rights, because he was not against slavery, but he was in favor of the Union. And his presence on the ticket probably did help Abraham Lincoln get reelected. Probably a very interesting story because it was an election done during a civil war. Pretty amazing. Ulysses Grant granted pardons to a number of Confederate leaders. It was part of the Amnesty Act of 1872. Again, sort of trying to heal the wounds of the Civil War. Interestingly, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison pardoned Mormons convicted of polygamy. Interesting, supporting religious freedom and correcting what they thought was an inappropriate prosecution of someone for their religious views. Theodore Roosevelt pardoned a Filipino general who was convicted of anti-American activities. Remember, the Spanish-American War, which was under William McKinley, was the beginning of our colonial period, in which we took on territories like the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And again, I would call it reconciliation. It was pardoning someone that was fought against the U.S. In connection with the Philippines. Remember, the Philippines we acquired through the war with Spain, which was what we call it the Spanish-American War. That was under William McKinley. William McKinley, shortly after he was reelected, was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, and Theodore Roosevelt, who was vice president at the time, did not run with William McKinley when he first ran in 1896. William McKinley's vice president, who was on the ticket with him in 1896, died in office. There was no method then, we have one now, of replacing him, but he replaced them with Theodore Roosevelt. Interesting story, which we've discussed before. Teddy Roosevelt was an activist Republican reformer, and a lot of Republican leadership were very nervous about the presence of Theodore Roosevelt and the possibility that he might succeed William McKinley, and lo and behold, it happened. And unlike the four presidents that died in office in the 1800s, the four presidents who took on the presidency in the 1900s, all were successful in terms of running for re-election. If you recall from your history books, that's Theodore Roosevelt, that's Calvin Coolidge, that's Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson. And the four from the 1800s were very unsuccessful. None of them were reelected. Andrew Johnson is usually recognized as one of our worst presidents, and he wanted to run again for re-election, but he was not supported by either party, the Democrats or the Republicans. And the others were the two Whig presidents that were succeeded by their vice presidents, Millard Fillmore and John Tyler, and they were unsuccessful. The fourth one was James Garfield, who was succeeded by Chester Arthur, who actually historians rank as a pretty capable president, but he got no support to run again after the term was up, Garfield's term was up. So let's think of a few more of these pardons. Calvin Coolidge, he pardoned Marcus Garvey, who's sort of a famous person in our Black history. He was a Jamaican immigrant, and he was convicted of mail fraud. Calvin Coolidge pardoned him, but also arranged for his deportation back to Jamaica. And he also pardoned, interestingly enough, a German spy back in the World War I era in 1918, after the fact, I think it was 1923. Gerald Ford famously gave conditional amnesty to Vietnam draft resistors. That was a big group. It was 50,000 people that he gave amnesty to. And by President Carter in, I think, 1977, gave them a full pardon. Again, that clearly was a reconciliation of all the problems dealing with Vietnam. Perhaps one of the most famous pardons, which was controversial, was Gerald Ford's pardoning of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was in the process of potentially being impeached and indicted for obstruction of justice. You remember the Justice Department's position during the impeachment processes with Donald Trump. Their position was that a sitting president couldn't be indicted, but they were proceeding in an indictment of Richard Nixon. Didn't happen because Gerald Ford pardoned him. He clearly looked at that as reconciliation. And I think that's a fair way to characterize it, but it was very controversial, and a lot of historians believe it contributed to his defeat when he tried to run for re-election in 1976 and lost to Jimmy Carter. And it was a preemptive pardon, very broad. There is a school of thought that thinks that the pardons should be very specific. It's never been challenged. There was some discussion about that when Donald Trump was considering pardons also. But the only court challenges about presidential pardons have all concluded that whatever the action was constitutional. I guess the other area that is common to a few presidents that in my opinion is consistent, I think it's consistent with the intent of the Founding Fathers. They pardon people whose offenses are viewed less seriously after the fact than when they were first imposed. You had Barack Obama and John Kennedy pardoning people in connection with what you might characterize as minor drug offenses. And you had FDR, who had the most pardons, but of course he served the longest. He was, 3 full terms and partially into his 4th term. So he had more opportunities to issue pardons. But he pardoned a bunch of people that were convicted under the Prohibition era, and Prohibition later was repealed by a constitutional amendment, and he pardoned a bunch of people that were categorized as being convicted of those type offenses. And, I think you could say that was consistent with the Founding Fathers' intention. Now, let's talk about some of these political pardons. I call them political pardons. Andrew Jackson, Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, they all gave pardons to political allies where you could conclude that they were done for political reasons and political purposes. Nixon pardoned Jimmy Hoffa. Well, that's an interesting action by Richard Nixon, and I think I characterize that as political. Gerald Ford pardoned people associated with Watergate, like G. Gordon Liddy. Ronald Reagan, some of us may remember this, he pardoned George Steinbrenner. Remember, he was convicted of campaign finance violations in connection with Richard Nixon's presidential campaigns. I call that political. Clinton, for heaven's sakes, pardoned his brother for a narcotics offense. And by the way, his brother got into trouble over that narcotics offenses later and was convicted. And the pardon didn't extend to those acts after he was pardoned for what he was convicted of earlier. Also, Clinton did one of the more controversial pardons of Mark Rich, if you recall. No explanation, but Mark Rich and his family was a big political donor. He was convicted of, I think it was insider trading, it was financial things, and he fled the country. And Clinton gave him a pardon. George Bush Sr. pardoned people that were associated with the Iran-Contra scandal under Ronald Reagan. I don't know if people still remember that, but it's an example of a clearly impeachable act that Congress decided not to act on. Tip O'Neill argued against taking act. I don't know if people remember the Iran-Contra thing, but it was basically getting around a congressional prohibition of aiding the rebels in Nicaragua against the Sandinistas. And they did it through an arms sale with Iran. Tip O'Neill resisted calls by the Democrats to impeach Ronald Reagan over it. He didn't explain why. Later, after his death, it was revealed he felt it wasn't a good idea because the country had pretty recently gone through Watergate. Didn't think it would be good to go through that again. Reagan was at the end of his second term. He wasn't going to run again. And it was pretty widely known that Ronald Reagan was suffering from an early stage of Alzheimer's, so Tip O'Neill opposed it. But George Bush Sr., now that's older, he pardoned several people associated with that scandal, including Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense. And it was controversial in part because the story was that George Bush Sr. was kind of involved in that, and it came up during his campaign. He was running for election on his own after Reagan left office. You know, some other kind of odd pardons. I mean, Gerald Ford pardoned Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Why in the world did he do that? No explanation. It's old Confederates, which, well after the fact, and Donald Trump gave a pardon to Susan B. Anthony. Now, well after the fact, kind of political theater. I mean, who really cares? But it's sort of an odd use of presidential pardon authority. Now, Trump was involved in controversies because it kind of related to why there was opposition during the Constitutional Convention about such broad presidential pardon authority. Because he pardoned people that were convicted in association with the investigation of his campaign's theoretical collusion with the Russians during the 2016 campaign. So he pardoned people like Michael Flynn, who clearly, well, he pleaded guilty. He was involved in dealings with a Russian operative who clearly was inappropriate and against the law. And he pardoned Roger Stone, the same situation, very clearly involved in an offense that was inappropriate in his coordination with WikiLeaks and his lying to the FBI. Again, it could lead to a problem for the president, the ex-president, because if they've been pardoned, they have no grounds for using their Fifth Amendment privileges in terms of testimony. We'll see if that develops into anything. We'll see. That's a picture of an odd part of our Constitution, borrowed from the British common law. Today, I think a lot of people would agree with the opposition to unlimited pardon authority of the president. The argument being that, hey, the president could direct somebody to commit a crime and then, by agreement, pardon them afterwards. And that's sort of what happened with Donald Trump. It's clearly not what the Founding Fathers had in mind. So I hope this is responsive to the request that we address this issue, and I'm assuming it got addressed because it got a lot of play as Donald Trump was leaving office. So this is the end of our 4th lecture in our series. Remember, we have 2 dates in May for the 5th and 6th lectures. One will be on that big political upset, presidential upset in 1948 of Harry Truman over Thomas Dewey. And on May 10th, we'll talk about the influence of third-party politics in presidential elections. So thank you, and we'll see you again on May 3rd. Thanks.